A boy with no legs shows a millionaire that even in suffering, it is possible to find purpose and joy. In the solitude of a luxurious mansion, Mark Thorne lives trapped by painful memories and the weight of an irreparable loss. But on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, fate leads him to meet Sam, a boy with no legs who, with simple tools and an unshakable will, transforms broken bicycles and spreads joy wherever he goes. What could a millionaire, devastated by the past, possibly learn from a boy full of limitations, but also dreams? Could Mark's heart, hardened by grief, find redemption alongside Sam? This is yet another beautiful story from Living Narratives, where you experience the true emotion of stories that make you reflect on life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and join us as we discover how this extraordinary journey unfolds. The click of leather shoes echoed through the vast halls of Mark Thorne's mansion. Each step sounded hollow, swallowed by the cavernous emptiness of a home that once pulsed with life. The grandeur of the estate, crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and priceless works of art lining the walls now felt like a cruel mockery. It was a mausoleum, preserving the memories of a life Mark no longer recognized as his own. He paused in front of the grand piano, its lid closed, its keys untouched for years. A single framed photo rested on top, a frozen moment of joy. Mark, his wife Clara, and their son, Lucas, their smiles wide and full of promise. Mark's hand hovered over the frame, trembling slightly before he pulled it back and turned away. The kitchen staff, long dismissed, had left the counters barren except for a single mug and a half-empty bottle of scotch. Mark poured himself another. A drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass like the storm inside him. He sank into the leather armchair by the window, the city lights below blurring into streaks as he stared out, lost in the haze of his thoughts. The world outside moved on, oblivious to his existence, and he preferred it that way. Isolation had become his armor, shielding him from the weight of pitying eyes and well-meaning platitudes. But tonight, the armor felt suffocating. Mark stood abruptly, the chair creaking in protest. The scotch remained untouched on the side table as he grabbed his car keys and headed to the garage. The sleek black car, a symbol of his wealth and success, roared to life, its engine reverberating through the empty space. He drove aimlessly, the streets unfamiliar and unwelcoming. He wasn't sure what he was searching for, perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. The rhythmic hum of the tires, against the asphalt, was interrupted by a sight that caught his attention. On a dimly lit street corner, a group of children had gathered, their laughter carrying through the crisp night air. Mark slowed the car, his eyes drawn to the center of the commotion. There, surrounded by the chaos of giggles and shouts, sat a boy. His legs were missing, but his hands moved with practiced precision as he tightened a bolt on an old bicycle. Tools lay scattered around him, and the smiles of the other children were directed entirely at him, as if his energy was contagious. Mark parked the car a short distance away and watched from the shadows. The boy, no older than 10, seemed unbothered by his own limitations. He laughed along with the other children, his face glowing with a sense of purpose that Mark hadn't felt in years. One by one, the children rode off on repaired bicycles, their shouts of gratitude echoing in the quiet street. The boy remained, tidying his tools and humming a tune Mark couldn't place. Intrigued, Mark stepped out of the car, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The boy looked up, his eyes sharp and curious. "Need a bike fixed?" he asked, his voice light, but direct. Mark hesitated, unsure of what had drawn him here in the first place. He glanced at the boy's tools, at the determination etched into his small frame, and felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. "No," Mark said finally. "I was just passing by." The boy nodded, unbothered by the lack of a response. He went back to organizing his tools, his movements methodical and precise. Mark lingered, feeling the strange pull of this boy who seemed so at ease in a world that had been nothing but cruel to him. "What's your name?" Mark asked. "Sam," the boy replied without looking up. "What's yours?" Mark hesitated again. It had been so long since anyone had asked him that question without already knowing the answer. "Mark," he said. Sam finally looked up, his eyes meeting Mark's with a gaze that was far too wise for his age. "Well, Mark," he said with a small smile, "everyone's got something they're trying to fix. What's yours?" The question caught Mark off guard. He opened his mouth to respond but found no words. How could he explain the weight of his grief, the emptiness that no amount of money or success could fill? Instead, he simply nodded and turned back toward his car. As he drove away, Sam's words echoed in his mind, intertwining with the image of the boy's unshakable spirit. That night, as Mark lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the silence of the mansion felt heavier than ever. He couldn't shake the memory of Sam, the way he had transformed discarded bicycles into treasures for other children. It wasn't just the boy's skill that lingered in Mark's mind. It was his purpose, his ability to find joy and meaning in circumstances that would break most people. For the first time in years, Mark felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was enough to make him wonder. Who was this boy, and how had he learned to shine so brightly in the shadows? As sleep finally claimed him, Mark's last thought was a question he couldn't ignore. What if Sam was the key to fixing what Mark thought was beyond repair? Mark Thorne couldn't shake the image of the boy. As he sat in his mansion the following morning, the warmth of his untouched coffee slowly fading into the marble countertop, the memory of Sam's confident hands fixing that battered bicycle played on repeat in his mind. The boy's eyes, so sharp and curious, had looked right through him, as though seeing something Mark himself had long forgotten. He'd asked, "What's yours?" and the words had lingered in Mark's chest like a splinter, impossible to ignore. Unable to focus on anything else, Mark grabbed his keys and drove back to the street corner. He told himself it was curiosity, a way to pass the time in a life otherwise filled with too much of it, but deep down, he knew it was something more. The quiet hope of finding an answer, perhaps, or at least understanding the boy's relentless optimism in a world that had left both of them so broken. When he arrived, the scene was different but no less compelling. A few kids were already gathered around Sam, their laughter filling the air as he worked on a rusted chain with his calloused hands. Sam's tools, scattered on a worn-out blanket, seemed too crude to accomplish much, yet they moved in his grip with the precision of a master craftsman. The boy didn't notice Mark at first, too focused on his task. But when he did look up, a flicker of recognition passed through his eyes. "Back again?" Sam asked, wiping the grease off his hands with a rag. His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the curiosity of someone who couldn't quite understand why a man like Mark was there. Mark hesitated, feeling strangely out of place. "I wanted to see how you do it," he said, gesturing to the half-fixed bike in front of Sam. Sam raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching in a faint smile. "You mean how I fix things?" Mark nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Yeah, something like that." The boy gestured for Mark to sit on the curb beside him, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, Mark obeyed. The pavement was cold, and the rough surface felt foreign against his tailored slacks. He watched as Sam went back to work, his small hands moving deftly over the bike's gears. "It's not hard," Sam said after a moment, glancing sideways at Mark. "You just have to look at what's broken and figure out how to make it work again." Mark frowned, his gaze fixed on the boy. "That's easier said than done." Sam shrugged, his focus never wavering from the bike. "Not really. Most people just don't want to try. They're scared it won't work, so they leave it broken." The words hit Mark harder than he expected. He thought of his mansion, filled with expensive things that had long lost their meaning. He thought of his life, once vibrant and full, now little more than a series of empty days strung together. Sam's hands stilled for a moment as he looked up, his expression thoughtful. "You're not here because you care about bikes, are you?" Sam asked, his voice gentle but probing. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. How could he explain the weight of his grief to a boy who had no legs and yet smiled as though the world were his playground? Instead, he deflected. "What about you? Why do you do this?" Sam smiled, the kind of smile that carried a wisdom far beyond his years. "Because it makes people happy, and when they're happy, I'm happy." Mark studied the boy, his heart heavy with a mix of admiration and confusion. "That's it? That's enough for you?" Sam's gaze didn't waver. Why wouldn't it be? The simplicity of the answer left Mark silent. For so long, he had measured life by the weight of his losses, by the things he'd failed to hold on to. But here was a boy who had every reason to feel bitter, and yet he didn't. It was as though Sam had discovered some secret that had eluded Mark his entire life. "Do you always fix bikes here?" Mark asked, changing the subject. Sam nodded. "Yeah, it's a good spot. The kids know where to find me." He paused, his expression turning serious. "You'd be surprised how many people think a broken bike isn't worth fixing. They just throw it away." Mark's chest tightened. He thought of all the things he'd thrown away, dreams, relationships, his own sense of purpose. "What about you?" he asked quietly. "What happens when something breaks and you can't fix it?" Sam's hands stilled, and he looked up at Mark with an expression that was both solemn and resolute. "Then I find another way to use it," he said simply, "because everything has a purpose. You just have to look for it." Mark felt his throat tighten, the boy's words resonating with a part of him he'd long buried. Before he could respond, a group of kids came running up, their laughter breaking the heavy silence. Sam's face lit up as he greeted them, his hands already moving to inspect the bikes they'd brought. Mark watched from the sidelines, feeling like an outsider in a world he didn't understand but desperately wanted to be a part of. As he got up to leave, Sam called out to him. "Hey, Mark," the boy said, his smile wide and genuine. "You should come back. Maybe I can teach you how to fix something." Mark nodded, the corners of his mouth twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. "Maybe you can." As he drove away, the streets once again unfamiliar and unwelcoming, Mark realized something had shifted. For the first time in years, he felt a pull toward something, a sense of curiosity, of purpose. And though he couldn't yet name it, he knew it had everything to do with a boy named Sam and the way he made broken things whole again. The next time Mark drove to the corner where Sam fixed bicycles, he found the boy surrounded by an even larger group of children. The sun was high in the sky, casting warm rays over the gathering. Mark parked a short distance away and watched as Sam worked, his small hands moving with practiced efficiency. The children waited patiently for their turns, their faces glowing with anticipation. Mark couldn't help but notice how Sam's energy seemed to uplift everyone around him. This time, Mark didn't hesitate. He got out of his car and walked over, the hum of conversation and laughter filling the air. Sam looked up and smiled when he saw him. "You came back," Sam said, his tone both surprised and pleased. Mark nodded, his hands stuffed awkwardly into his pockets. "I told you I might." Sam gestured for Mark to sit down on the curb beside him, and Mark complied, feeling a strange sense of comfort in the chaos surrounding them. "You're just in time," Sam said, holding up a bicycle tire. "This one's a challenge. Want to help?" Mark blinked, caught off guard. "I'm not sure I'd be much use." Sam shrugged, his grin unwavering. "Doesn't matter. You can't learn if you don't try." With a sigh, Mark took the tire from Sam and held it awkwardly. Sam handed him a wrench and began explaining what needed to be done. Despite his initial reluctance, Mark found himself following the boy's instructions. His movements were clumsy at first, but Sam's patience and encouragement made it easier. They worked. Mark noticed how naturally Sam interacted with the children. They didn't see him as someone with limitations. To them, he was just Sam, the boy who could fix anything. Mark envied that, the way Sam seemed to command respect and admiration without ever demanding it. How did you learn to, or do all this? Mark asked, his voice low enough that the question didn't carry beyond their small space. Sam shrugged, his focus still on the bike in front of him. You figure things out when you need to. When you don't have much, you learn to make the most of what you've got. Mark considered this, his hands stilling on the tire. What about your family? Do they help you? Sam's hands paused for a brief moment before continuing. I live at the shelter now. My mom, she couldn't take care of me anymore. But it's okay. I've got friends here. And bikes. He grinned, the sadness in his voice masked by the brightness of his smile. Mark's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, but no words seemed adequate. Instead, he focused on tightening the bolt in front of him, the rhythmic turn of the wrench grounding him. When they finished the bike, one of the children jumped up and down with excitement. Thanks, Sam, you're the best, she said, her voice full of admiration. Sam laughed and waved her off, as though the praise were nothing out of the ordinary. Mark couldn't help but smile at the scene. You're good with them, he said, gesturing to the children. Sam shrugged again. They just want someone to believe in them. That's all anyone really needs. The simplicity of the statement struck Mark deeply. He thought of his own life, of all the people who had once believed in him, and how he'd pushed them away. He wondered if it was too late to change that. As the afternoon wore on, Mark stayed by Sam's side, helping where he could and watching the boy work his quiet magic. When the last bike was fixed and the children had gone, Sam leaned back on his hands and looked at Mark. So, did you learn anything today? Sam asked, his grin teasing but kind. Mark chuckled softly. Yeah, I learned that I'm terrible with tools. Sam laughed, the sound light and genuine. You'll get better. You just need practice. Mark nodded, his smile fading into something more thoughtful. Thanks, Sam, for letting me be a part of this. Sam's expression softened. Any time, Mark. Everyone's got something they can fix. You've just got to figure out what it is. Mark drove home that evening with a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, he felt like he'd done something that mattered, even if it was just fixing a bicycle. Sam's words echoed in his mind, a quiet reminder that perhaps, just perhaps, it wasn't too late to find purpose again. Mark returned to the street corner the next day, carrying a small box of tools he had purchased earlier that morning. He had spent nearly an hour wandering the aisles of the hardware store, overwhelmed by the variety of wrenches, pliers, and other gadgets he barely knew how to use. When the cashier had asked him if he was starting a project, Mark had hesitated before answering, something like that. Now, as he parked his car and approached Sam's makeshift repair station, he felt a nervous energy he couldn't quite explain. Sam was already surrounded by children, their bikes in varying states of disrepair. The boy's face lit up when he saw Mark approaching, the box of tools tucked under his arm. You brought reinforcements, Sam said, grinning as he wiped his hands on a rag. Mark set the box down on the curb and shrugged. Figured I'd make myself useful. Sam chuckled, his eyes gleaming with approval. All right, let's see what you've got. The children watched with curiosity as Mark opened the box, revealing the shiny new tools. Sam picked up a wrench and turned it over in his hands, nodding appreciatively. Nice. But remember, it's not about the tools. It's about what you do with them. Mark smiled faintly, the boy's words carrying a weight that went beyond their immediate context. He rolled up his sleeves and joined Sam, following the boys' instructions as they worked through the line of waiting bicycles. The kids cheered when their bikes were fixed, riding off with wide grins, only to be replaced by new faces and new challenges. As the afternoon stretched on, Mark found himself falling into a rhythm. The clink of tools, the chatter of children, and the steady presence of Sam created a strange but comforting harmony. For the first time in years, Mark felt a sense of belonging, a feeling he hadn't realized he missed so deeply. During a brief lull, Mark sat back on the curb, wiping sweat from his brow. Sam plopped down beside him, a satisfied look on his face. "You're getting better," Sam said, nudging Mark with his elbow. "I have a good teacher," Mark replied. His tone light but sincere. He paused, glancing at the boy. "How did you end up here, Sam? Fixing bikes, helping all these kids? What made you start?" Sam's smile faltered for a moment, and he looked down at his hands, which were smeared with grease. "When I was younger, my mom used to say that everyone has something to give, even if it's small. She couldn't give me much, but she always found a way to help someone else. I guess I just wanted to do the same." Mark's chest tightened. He could hear the longing in Sam's voice, the way the boy's words carried both pride and sadness. "She sounds like an incredible woman," Mark said softly. Sam nodded, his smile returning, though it was tinged with melancholy. "She was. She taught me that it doesn't matter what you don't have. What matters is what you do with what you've got." Mark looked away, his gaze drifting to the horizon. He thought about his own life, the years he had spent consumed by what he had lost rather than what he still had. Sam's words felt like a quiet rebuke, a reminder of a lesson Mark had yet to learn. "You know," Sam said after a moment, breaking the silence, "you don't have to keep coming back. But I'm glad you do." Mark turned to the boy, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Why do you say that?" Sam shrugged, his grin returning. "Because everyone's got something they can fix. Even you." The simplicity of the statement left Mark speechless. Before he could respond, a new group of kids approached, their bikes rattling and squeaking with every step. Sam stood and dusted off his hands, ready to get back to work. "Come on, Mark," he said, tossing a wrench his way. "Break's over." Mark caught the wrench, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "All right, boss, lead the way. Lead the—" As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the street, Mark realized that something had shifted within him. The weight he carried didn't feel quite as heavy, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't just the bikes they were fixing, it was something deeper, something harder to name but impossible to ignore. And it was all thanks to a boy who saw possibilities where others saw only broken pieces. Mark drove to Sam's corner the next morning, but something felt different. The usual buzz of children's laughter and the faint sound of clinking tools were missing. As he parked and stepped out of his car, the silence felt heavy, pressing against his chest. He saw Sam sitting on the curb alone, his toolbox closed beside him. The boy's usual spark was dimmed, his expression thoughtful but strained. "Hey, Sam," Mark called out, trying to keep his tone light. "What's going on?" Sam looked up, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning, Mark. Just thinking about stuff." Mark walked over and sat down beside him. "Want to talk about it?" Sam hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. Finally, he let out a small sigh. "There's this lot down the street. It's empty, just sitting there. I was thinking it would be the perfect place to build a park. A place where all the kids could play, even ones like me." Mark's eyebrows rose. "A park? That's a big dream, Sam." Sam nodded, his eyes lighting up for a moment before the doubt crept back in. "Yeah, but I don't know how to make it happen. I mean, who's going to listen to a kid who can't even reach the swings?" Mark frowned, his heart aching at the boy's self-deprecating tone. "Don't sell yourself short. You've got a way of making things happen. Look at all these kids you've helped with their bikes. That's no small thing." Sam shrugged, kicking at a loose pebble on the ground. "Fixing bikes is different. This is huge, and I don't even know where to start." Mark leaned back, his gaze drifting to the empty lot Sam had mentioned. It was overgrown with weeds, the chain-link fence surrounding it rusted and sagging in places. But Sam was right. It could be something more, something better. "Well," Mark began, "every big idea starts small. Maybe we can figure this out together." Sam's eyes widened. "You mean it?" Mark smiled. "Sure. Let's see what we can do." That afternoon, they began brainstorming. Sam's vision for the park was clear, a place where kids of all abilities could play without barriers. wide paths for wheelchairs, adaptive playground equipment, and plenty of space for everyone to feel included. As they talked, Mark jotted down notes, his own enthusiasm growing with each detail Sam described. But as the days turned into weeks, they hit their first obstacle. When Mark tried to inquire about purchasing or leasing the lot, he was met with resistance. The owner, a stubborn older man named Mr. Grayson, refused to sell. "It's not for sale," Grayson had said bluntly when Mark visited his office. "And even if it was, what makes you think a park is the best use for it? Kids don't need parks these days. They've got their phones and video games." Mark left the meeting frustrated but not deterred. He shared the news with Sam that evening, and the boy's face fell. "So that's it? We just give up?" "Not a chance," Mark said firmly. "This is just the first hurdle. We'll figure something out." Sam's lips pressed into a thin line, his determination mirroring Mark's. "What do we do next?" Mark hesitated, then smiled. "We start rallying support. If we can show Grayson how much this park would mean to the community, he might change his mind." Sam's eyes lit up. Again, his earlier doubt replaced by a spark of hope. "Okay, let's do it." Over the next few weeks, they worked tirelessly. Sam and the kids he had helped with their bikes began spreading the word, talking to neighbors, teachers, and anyone who would listen. Mark used his connections to reach out to local businesses and organizations, pitching the idea of a park that could bring the community together. Slowly but surely, their efforts began to pay off. Letters of support poured in, and the momentum grew. But not everyone was on their side. Some questioned Mark's motives, suggesting that a millionaire like him couldn't possibly care about a project like this. Others doubted Sam's ability to see the plan through, pointing out his age and physical limitations. One evening, after a particularly discouraging meeting with a potential sponsor, Mark found Sam sitting on the curb, staring at the empty lot. The boy's shoulders were slumped, his usual energy nowhere to be seen. "Tough day," Mark said, sitting down beside him. Sam nodded silently, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Finally, he spoke. "What if they're right? What if we can't do this?" Mark placed a hand on Sam's shoulder, his voice steady. "Sam, you once told me that everything has a purpose. Well, this is ours, and things that matter, they're not supposed to be easy, but that doesn't mean we stop trying." Sam looked up at Mark, his eyes searching. Slowly, he nodded. "You're right. We can't give up. Not now, not ever," Mark said, his tone resolute. Together they turned back to face the lot, their shared determination stronger than ever. They weren't just building a park, they were building something far more meaningful, a symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of community. The days following their first major setback were quieter but no less determined. Mark and Sam continued to work tirelessly, though the weight of doubt lingered. The growing support from the community helped to keep their spirits up, but there were moments, private and unspoken, when both of them wondered if the project would ever come to life. One evening, Mark invited Sam over to his mansion. Sam hesitated at first, unused to anything resembling luxury, but Mark insisted. "It's not about the house," he had said. "It's about taking a break. Sometimes you need to step back to see the bigger picture." When Sam arrived, he was visibly overwhelmed. The grand entryway, the marble floors, the high ceilings, all of it seemed out of place in Sam's world. But what struck him most was the emptiness. The vast rooms felt more like a museum than a home. Mark noticed the boy's reaction and gave him a small, knowing smile. "You get used to it," he said, leading Sam to the kitchen, where a modest dinner was laid out on the counter. As they ate, the conversation turned reflective. Sam, always the optimist, tried to lift the mood. "You know, once the park is done, this place could use a bike ramp. Or two. Might liven it up a bit." Mark chuckled, the sound warm but fleeting. "You're probably right." Then, after a pause, he added, "Sam, why do you keep going? Why do you push so hard when things get tough?" Sam looked up, his fork hovering in mid-air. The question caught him off guard, but he answered without hesitation, "Because if I don't, who will? The world's not going to fix itself. Someone has to try. Mark's gaze softened. You're wise beyond your years. You know that. Sam shrugged, a hint of a smile on his lips. You've just got to look at what you have, not what you don't. My mum used to say that all the time. The mention of Sam's mother seemed to open a door, and for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of vulnerability in the boy. He decided to take a chance. What happened to her? Sam's smile faltered, and he set his fork down carefully. She tried her best, you know. But after my accident, it was hard. She couldn't handle everything. Eventually, I ended up at the shelter. Mark's heart ached at the simplicity of the statement, the way Sam seemed to accept his circumstances without bitterness. That must have been tough, he said quietly. Sam nodded, but didn't. Elaborate. Instead, he turned the question back to Mark. What about you? You live in this big house all by yourself. Why? Mark hesitated, his instinct to deflect clashing with the boy's earnest gaze. Finally, he took a deep breath. I wasn't always alone. I had a family, a wife and a son, but I lost them in an accident a few years ago. Sam's eyes widened, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Sam said softly, I'm sorry, Mark. That must have been really hard. Mark nodded, his throat tight. It was. And for a long time I thought that was it, that there was no coming back from it. But then I met you. Sam blinked, clearly surprised. Me? Mark managed a small smile. You've shown me that even when things seem broken beyond repair, there's still a way forward. It's not easy, but it's possible. You remind me of my son in some ways. The way you see the world, the way you refuse to give up. Sam looked down, his cheeks tinged with color. For once, the boy who always seemed to have the right words was silent. You know, Mark continued, you're the first person I've talked to about this in a long time, and it feels lighter, like maybe the past doesn't have to define everything. Sam glanced up, his eyes shining with a mix of emotions. It doesn't, Mark. You can't change what happened, but you can change what you do with it. The simplicity of Sam's words hit Mark with the force of a revelation. He reached across the table and rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. Thank you, Sam, for everything. Sam smiled, his confidence returning. Don't thank me yet. We still have a park to build. Mark chuckled, the sound freer than it had been in years. You're right. Let's get to it. That night, as Sam left the mansion and Mark watched him go, something had shifted. The scars they both carried were still there, but they felt less like weights and more like reminders of what they had endured and what they could overcome together. The momentum for the park project began to grow rapidly after Mark and Sam's heartfelt conversation. It was as though their shared vulnerabilities had infused them with a renewed sense of purpose. Mark threw himself into the logistics with a vigor he hadn't felt in years, while Sam's determination and charm rallied the community in ways no adult could have managed. One sunny morning, Mark and Sam stood side by side at the lot, now partially cleared thanks to volunteers who had heard their story. The sagging chain-link fence had been replaced by a temporary wooden barrier adorned with handwritten signs, future home of our community park, and a place for everyone. Children had drawn colourful pictures on the signs, and the sight brought a rare smile to Mark's face. It's starting to look like something, Mark said, hands on his hips as he surveyed the space. Sam grinned, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair. Told you we could do it. We're not done yet, Mark replied, his tone teasing but proud. We've got permits to secure, equipment to buy, and about 1 million other things to figure out. Sam shrugged, undeterred. We'll get there one step at a time. Their optimism, however, was soon put to the test. Later that week, Mark received a letter from the city's planning office, rejecting their initial proposal due to zoning restrictions. The news hit hard. Mark had hoped his connections and the growing community support would smooth the process, but bureaucracy proved to be a stubborn obstacle. They said no, Sam asked, his brow furrowed as Mark explained the situation. For now, Mark said, his jaw tight. But we're not giving up. We'll appeal. We'll gather more support, get signatures, hold meetings, whatever it takes. Sam nodded, though. The frustration was evident in his expression. We've come too far to stop now. Mark placed a reassuring hand on Sam's shoulder. Exactly. This is just a bump in the road. We'll figure it out. And figure it out they did. Over the following weeks, they organized a petition drive, gathering signatures from residents who supported the park. Mark used his experience in business to draft a detailed appeal, while Sam and his network of kids created colorful posters and flyers to spread the word. Community meetings were held at the local school, where Sam spoke passionately about his vision for a place where everyone, no matter their abilities, could feel included. "This isn't just about a park," Sam said at one meeting, his voice steady despite the crowd of adults watching him. "It's about giving people a place to feel like they belong. It's about showing kids like me that we matter." His words struck a chord. By the end of the meeting, people were lining up to sign the petition and volunteer their time. Mark watched from the sidelines, his chest swelling with pride. Sam had a way of reaching people that he could only admire. Their efforts culminated in a second proposal, submitted with hundreds of signatures and letters of support attached. This time, they included a detailed plan for accessibility features, funding sources, and even a timeline for construction. When the planning office reviewed the new submission, the response was cautiously optimistic. "They want to meet with us," Mark told Sam one afternoon, holding up the letter he'd just received. "It's not a yes yet, but it's progress." Sam's face broke into a wide grin. "I knew it. I told you we could do it." Mark laughed, shaking his head. "You're impossible to discourage. You know that?" The meeting with the planning office was scheduled for the following week. Mark and Sam prepared meticulously, rehearsing their presentation and gathering additional support from local businesses and organizations. On the day of the meeting, they arrived at City Hall with a small group of supporters, including some of the children Sam had helped over the years. The conference room was imposing, with its high ceilings and long wooden table. Mark felt a flicker of nerves as they sat down, but one glance at Sam's confident expression steadied him. When it was their turn to speak, Mark began by outlining the technical details of the proposal, his tone professional and measured. Then he stepped aside, gesturing for Sam to take the floor. Sam rolled forward, his hands resting on the table in front of him. He looked directly at the panel of officials, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "This park isn't just a project," he said. "It's a chance to bring people together, to create something good in a world that's not always kind. It's about showing kids and adults that no matter how broken things seem, they can be fixed. You just have to try." The room was silent for a moment after he finished, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, one by one, the officials nodded, their expressions softening. By the end of the meeting, they had a tentative approval, contingent on a few additional steps. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a step forward. As they left City Hall, the small crowd of supporters broke into cheers, lifting Sam's chair off the ground in celebration. Mark laughed, the sound light and unrestrained. For the first time in years, he felt the full force of hope, not just for the park, but for himself, for Sam, and for the future they were building together. The approval from the city's planning office had felt like a triumph, but the challenges that followed were more daunting than Mark and Sam had anticipated. Construction delays, rising costs, and an unexpected storm that flooded the lot put their project at risk. Each setback weighed heavily on them, testing their resolve and their partnership. Mark sat in his office one evening, staring at the stack of invoices and permits spread across his desk. The numbers didn't add up. Even with the donations and volunteer support, they were still thousands of dollars short. He ran a hand through his hair, the frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. He had poured so much into this project, not just financially but emotionally, and now it seemed like it was slipping through his fingers. Sam, too, felt the strain. The boy's usual optimism had dimmed, replaced by a quiet worry he couldn't quite hide. He spent his days at the lot, helping where he could, but the sight of the unfinished park and the muddy aftermath of the storm left him feeling powerless. The other kids still came to see him, their belief in the project unshaken, but Sam struggled to match their enthusiasm. One afternoon, Mark found Sam sitting on the curb near the lot, staring at the construction equipment that had been left idle for days. The boy's shoulders were slumped, and his hands fidgeted with the edge of his shirt. "Hey, kid," Mark said gently as he approached. "You've been quiet lately. What's your mind?" Sam looked up, his expression a mix of frustration and sadness. "It feels like we're stuck, like no matter how hard we try, something always gets in the way." Mark sighed, sitting down beside him. "I know the feeling. This hasn't been easy, has it?" Sam shook his head. I thought it would be different. I thought if we worked hard enough, things would fall into place. But it's like every time we fix one problem, 3 more pop up." Mark nodded, his gaze drifting to the lot. "Yeah, it's been rough. But you know what? That's how it goes sometimes. Things worth doing are never easy." Sam was quiet for a moment, then asked softly, "Do you ever feel like giving up?" The question hit Mark harder than he expected. He thought of the nights spent worrying, the weight of failure looming over him, and the temptation to walk away from it all. But then he thought of Sam, the boy who had refused to let his own limitations define him, who had inspired an entire community to rally behind a shared dream. "I'd be lying if I said no," Mark admitted. "But then I think about why we started this in the first place, about the kids who'll get to play here, about you and everything you've taught me, and that makes it worth it." Sam's eyes brightened just a little, a flicker of hope breaking through his doubt. "You really think we can do it, even with all this?" Mark smiled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I do, but we're going to need to get creative, and we're going to need help." Over the next few days, they rallied once more. Mark reached out to his old business contacts, pitching the park as a community revitalization project and securing additional donations. Sam and the other kids organized a fundraising event, complete with a bike repair station, a bake sale, and games. The community's response was overwhelming, their belief in the project reignited by the determination of its youngest advocates. But just as things seemed to be turning around, another blow came. The contractor overseeing the construction pulled out, citing financial concerns and leaving the project without a clear path forward. The news hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He had worked so hard to keep everything moving, and now it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under them. Sam found him at the lot that evening, staring at the half-finished playground equipment with a look of quiet despair. "We lost the contractor," Mark said without turning around. "I don't know what we're going to do." Sam rolled up beside him, his expression thoughtful. "What do we always do? We figure it out. One step at a time, right?" Mark chuckled dryly. "You make it sound so simple." "Maybe it is," Sam said. "We've got the people. We've got the will. Maybe it's time we take this into our own hands." Mark turned to look at him, a spark of inspiration flickering in his eyes. "You're saying we do it ourselves?" Sam nodded. "Why not? We've got volunteers, we've got tools, and we've got a lot of people who believe in this park. We just need to believe in it too." The boy's unwavering optimism was infectious. For the first time in days, Mark felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. He placed a hand on Sam's head, ruffling his hair with a grin. "You're something else, you know." "That?" Sam laughed, the sound bright and full of promise. "Yeah, I've been told." The next morning, they called a meeting with the volunteers and supporters. Mark and Sam laid out their new plan, a fully community-driven effort to finish the park. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. People volunteered their time, their skills, and their resources, determined to see the project through. It wouldn't be easy, but as Mark looked around at the faces of everyone who had come together for this shared dream, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: certainty. They were going to make it happen together. The sun rose over the lot, casting a golden glow over what had once been a barren, forgotten space. Now, it was alive with activity. Volunteers bustled about, carrying tools, painting playground equipment, and laying down the final pieces of the park's foundation. The air buzzed with energy. A tangible sense of purpose, uniting everyone present. Mark stood near the edge of the lot, watching the progress with a mixture of pride and disbelief. It was happening. After months of setbacks and obstacles, the park was finally taking shape. Sam rolled up beside him, his face lit with a grin that seemed to radiate brighter than the morning sun. "Looks like it's really happening," Sam said, his voice filled with awe. Mark nodded, his own smile widening. "It sure does. And it's all thanks to you, Sam. You've inspired everyone here." Sam's cheeks flushed, and he looked down, fidgeting with the wheels of his chair. "I didn't do it alone. You've done just as much, maybe more." "Maybe," Mark said with a chuckle. "But this started with your dream, and look at it now." The park had transformed into something remarkable. Smooth, wide paths wound through the space, designed to accommodate. Wheelchairs and strollers, brightly colored playground equipment stood proudly at the center, complete with adaptive swings and sensory play areas. A small picnic area was tucked into one corner, shaded by newly planted trees. And in another corner, a community garden was being prepared where families could grow flowers and vegetables together. The sense of inclusion and possibility was overwhelming. It wasn't just a park, it was a symbol of hope, a testament to what could be achieved when people came together for a shared purpose. As the final touches were being added, a group of children arrived, their excitement palpable. They rushed toward the playground, their laughter filling the air as they explored every corner of the new space. Sam watched them with a look of quiet satisfaction, his eyes shimmering with emotion. "This is what it's all about," Sam said softly. "Seeing them happy, knowing they have a place where they belong." Mark placed a hand on Sam's shoulder, his voice steady. "You made this happen. Don't ever forget that." The grand opening ceremony was set to take place later that afternoon, but for now, the park was already serving its purpose. Families began to trickle in, marveling at the transformation and joining in the festivities. Volunteers worked tirelessly to ensure everything was perfect, their smiles reflecting the joy of being part of something meaningful. When the time came for the ceremony, a small stage had been set up near the entrance. A crowd had gathered, filling the park with a vibrant hum of conversation and anticipation. Mark stood at the side of the stage, watching as Sam prepared to speak. The boy was nervous, fidgeting slightly as he adjusted the microphone, but when he began to speak, his voice was clear and confident. "Thank you all for being here today," Sam began, his eyes scanning the crowd. "This park isn't just a place to play. It's a place to come together, to support one another, and to show that no matter what challenges we face, we can overcome them when we work together." His words were met with applause, and Sam continued, his voice growing stronger. "When we started this project, it felt like an impossible dream. But look around. This is what happens when people believe in something bigger than themselves. This is what happens when we don't give up." Tears pricked Mark's eyes as he listened. Sam's words resonated deeply, not just with the crowd, but with him personally. The boy had not only changed the community, but had also changed Mark's life in ways he never could have imagined. When Sam finished speaking, the crowd erupted into cheers. Mark stepped onto the stage and joined him, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder as he addressed the crowd. "Sam's right," Mark said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This park is more than just a space. It's a reminder of what we can accomplish when we come together, when we believe in each other, and when we refuse to let obstacles stand in our way." The applause was deafening, a wave of support and gratitude washing over them. As the ceremony concluded, Mark and Sam stood together, watching as the community embraced the park and all it represented. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the lot, Sam turned to Mark with a smile. "We did it." Mark nodded, his heart full. "We did. And this is just the beginning." The two of them stayed long after the crowd had dispersed, sitting side by side and watching as the park came alive with laughter and joy. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a testament to the power of resilience, determination, and the belief that even the most broken things could be made whole again. The park had transformed the neighborhood. What was once an overgrown lot was now a hub of laughter, connection, and joy. Children raced along the smooth paths, their laughter carrying in the breeze. Parents sat on benches, chatting and watching their kids play. The community garden began to flourish, with vibrant flowers and fresh vegetables sprouting in neatly organized plots. The park was more than a physical space. It was a testament to hope and resilience. Mark and Sam visited the park every day. For Mark, it was a way to stay connected to something greater than himself. For Sam, it was a dream realized, a living reminder that anything was possible with determination and support. They would often sit together near the playground, watching the children play, their hearts full of pride and peace. On one such evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the park in a golden glow, Sam turned to Mark with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Mark looked at him, surprised by the question. "Next?" Sam nodded. "Yeah. The park's done, but there's still so much more we could do. This is just the start." Mark smiled, his admiration for the boy, for growing with every passing day. "You're right. This is just the beginning. What did you have in mind?" Sam's eyes lit up, the spark of an idea taking shape. "What if we helped other neighborhoods do the same thing? There are so many places like this that could use a park, a garden, a place where people can come together. We could show them how to do it." Mark's heart swelled with pride. "That's an incredible idea, Sam, and I think we can make it happen." The two of them began to sketch out their plans, their excitement growing with each new idea. They talked about reaching out to other communities, organizing fundraisers, and teaching others how to create inclusive spaces. The park had become more than a project. It was a movement, one that they hoped would inspire change far beyond their little corner of the world. As the weeks turned into months, their vision began to take shape. With the help of the connections Mark had built and the unwavering support of the community, they started reaching out to other neighborhoods. They held workshops and shared their story, inspiring others to dream big and take action. But amidst the flurry of activity, they never lost sight of what mattered most. The park remained their sanctuary, a place where they could reflect on how far they had come and find the strength to keep moving forward. On quiet evenings, they would sit together and watch the sun set over the park, their bond stronger than ever. One evening, as they sat on their favorite bench, Sam turned to Mark with a mischievous grin. "You know, you're not so bad at fixing things after all." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "I had a pretty good teacher." Sam's smile softened, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks for believing in me, Mark. I couldn't have done this without you." Mark's throat tightened with emotion. "No, Sam, thank you. You've taught me more than I could ever teach you. You've shown me what it means to live with purpose and to never give up." They sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the park surrounding them, the laughter of children, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the soft hum of conversation created a symphony of life that filled the air. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Mark placed a hand on Sam's shoulder. "This is just the beginning, kid. We've got a lot more to do." Sam nodded, his smile widening. "Let's do it." And with that, they began their next chapter, ready to take on the world and prove that even the smallest sparks of hope could ignite a fire of change. What message did this story bring to you? Here at Living Narratives, we put our heart and soul into every video to inspire, move, and touch lives. If this story made you reflect or offered a new perspective, share with us in the comments what touched you the most and where you're watching from. We love hearing from you and feeling the special connection we create with each viewer. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every like and subscription is essential for us to continue bringing transformative stories like this one. Explore more videos here on Living Narratives and join us on this journey of emotion and learning. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you in the next video.